So, fellow Kenyans, today we celebrate the cultural diversity of Kenya, and we further strengthen our nationhood. For in the year 2015, I issued an executive order on the rotational hosting of our National Day celebrations in all our counties. Today, Kisumu City joins the growing list of counties that have played host to a National Day celebration. That is the counties of Nakuru, Nyeri, Machakos, Meru, Kakamega, Narok, Mombasa, and Kisii. This tradition allows for a focus on the positive contributions being made under devolution, while also enabling the hosting county to showcase itself on the national stage. Being in Kisumu today is significant and uplifting as we forge lasting bonds between the people of Kenya. This congregation here today is also a celebration of the handshake, a new political normal that not only embraces competition, but also encourages reconciliation and the healing of wounds, regardless of how fierce the competition was. The choice of Kisumu to host Madaraka Day this year is also intertwined with our national heritage, for there cannot be a better place to celebrate our liberation struggle and ponder the future of self-rule than here in Kisumu City. Kisumu is not only the historical hub of the East African Cooperation, it was also the intellectual incubator of some of the leading ideas behind our liberation movement. The national motto of Harambee, even though an import from India, was, for instance, introduced as a political rallying call here in Kisumu during the 1950s. After independence, our founding fathers popularized it as a national mantra of pulling together. Similarly, and led by Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Kisumu was the epicenter of the push to release Mzee Jomo Kenyatta and the Kapenguria Six from their illegal detention by the British colonizers. Furthermore, during the detention of the liberation heroes at Kapenguria, union leaders from this region joined other Kenyans and quickly stepped into the gap to ensure that the liberation momentum was not lost. It was pre-independence leaders from this region who taught us that musimu wacha ende mambo yake bwana. Haya, tuendelee sasa. It was pre-independence leaders from this region who taught us that attaining self-rule was not a one-man race. Rather, it was a relay in which one set out of runners fell out, another set was ready to continue the race. With such a well-appointed history of the struggle and the history of reconciliation that we are marking today, there cannot be a better place to commemorate Madaraka Day than here in Kisumu. Fellow Kenyans, today we celebrate close to 6 decades of self-rule. We celebrate the return of our liberties, the restoration of our dignity, and the democratic resilience that we have brought over the last 58 years. Today we also celebrate the war heroes who gave their all, including their lives, for us to be free. They sacrificed their freedom and their lives, knowing fully well that sometimes those who plant the seeds of freedom may never enjoy the fruits that follow. For their martyrdom, we honor our fallen heroes this Madaraka Day, and we do it fully conscious that a nation that does not honor its heroes will receive no honor amongst nations, to quote one thinker. As we celebrate self-rule today, we must also honor our founding fathers who dared to imagine Kenya, the bold and selfless architects of this great republic. And from this region of Nyanza, we honor, among others, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Tom Joseph Mboya, who was the architect of our economic blueprint at independence, and Achieng' Oneko, amongst others, who was one of the Kapenguria Six. Today we honor all the founding fathers of this nation, and we must also recall their principles of nationhood, and I will today just mention a few of these. One, they taught us that a progressive nation is one that is in continuous conversation with itself. This is because nationhood is a negotiated process that needs constant alignments and adjustments in the pursuit of perfection. The architects of Madaraka, however, warned us, a fact that I will not tire to remind you, that in making such adjustments and alignments, we must always avoid the paralysis of constitutional rigidity. Two, they taught us that self-rule is not an end in itself. It is a means to a greater end. Indeed, to quote T.J. Mboya, he said, and I quote, "Only through freedom and human rights could a people cooperate fully with their government," end of quote. But fellow Kenyans, freedom and human rights to be realized, the paradox of choices must be resolved. Three, they reveal the paradox when they emphasize that self-rule is the granting of opportunities, but accompanied by the burden of choice. Every opportunity in the exercise of freedoms and self-rule must be tempered by the consequence of choice. Every right granted must have a corresponding responsibility, and those who enjoy opportunities but neglect the burden of choice cannot be said to be truly free. This paradox of choices and freedoms applies to both individuals as well as institutions. Fellow Kenyans, based on some of these teachings, I believe we have built one of the most robust democracies in Africa. The fields of individual freedoms have expanded, and citizen participation has become emboldened. Our independent institutions have also occupied their rightful positions, and all of this because of the 2010 Constitution. And as I have said in the past, ours is probably one of the most progressive constitutions in the continent and indeed the world. However, since the 2010 Constitution expanded our individual fields of freedom, it also expanded the burden of the choices we make. Even our founding fathers urged the liberated patriots to shift from the status of being subjects to that of citizens when their fields of freedom were expanded. They made it clear that a citizen is someone who understands the responsibility that comes with freedom, while a subject will squander opportunities granted by self-rule and refuse to shoulder the burden of choice. Similarly, I believe the framers of the 2010 Constitution did not envision a situation where expanded fields of rights resulted in diminished responsibility by citizens and institutions. They saw a balance between freedoms and the consequences of choice. But this balance is probably most challenged by the growth of our independent institutions. Their growth has stretched our democratic boundaries to the limit, but it has not cracked them. It has bent the will of the people, but it has not broken it. In fact, any other African country experiencing the political turns and twists that we have experienced in the search of greater perfection in our nationhood, I believe would have burst asunder, and we have seen many such examples across our land and continent. From the nullification of a presidential election in 2017 to an attempt to stop the will of the people as expressed through the BBI, the judiciary has indeed tested our constitutional limits. While I stand by the rule of law, and I will always obey the decisions of that is why our national conversation today must focus on the consequences of choice. If citizens are required to exercise their will and shoulder the burden of their choices, should the independent institutions therefore not do likewise? In the field of independence, we have expanded the independence in the judiciary. But how should they expand their field of their responsibility and respond to the summons of nationhood? Shouldn't their decisions also be accompanied by the burden of choice? These are the questions of our national conversation, and we should objectively ponder them. And here I must be frank and ask what I believe to be legitimate questions. It is a fact that we were losing close to 1 billion shillings every working hour for the 123 days we held the 2017 election. The question the national conversation should therefore ask is who carried the burden of this choice? Was it the judiciary or the people? The truth of the matter is that it was the people who carried the burden of the choice. Development programs meant to make a difference in the lives of people had to be shelved. The second is that as a consequence of 2017, we initiated, together with millions of Kenyans, the BBI process that was meant to build bridges and create inclusive politics and end ethnic majoritarianism. If the court had subjected its decision to stop BBI to a cost-benefit analysis, in other words, if it had considered the burden of choice, then there are questions the judiciary would have asked. If we indeed were at a constitutional moment, is a decision against BBI a decision in support of the status quo? If BBI were to be stopped, who carries the burden of choice? On whose shoulders will ethnic majoritarianism rest? And who will carry the burden of losing 30% of our national budget every 5 years due to the toxic politics that BBI sought to resolve? The judiciary would have asked itself another question. Can Kenya truly be a democracy if the people are denied the opportunity to express their sovereign and supreme choice at the ballot box on the basis of elevating technicalities over the overriding objectives of the law. Our Constitution, fellow Kenyans, is not a yoke around our necks, but rather it should be a mighty sword that can break the chains that limit all of us as citizens. The moral foundations of justice demands that the judiciary bears the burden of choice and the consequences, therefore, especially when the burden of judicial choices is proposed to be carried out by the people. Fellow Kenyans, as I turn to the national question of our times, as is the national tradition every Madaraka Day, I wish to remind us of an instruction left behind by the founding father of our nation, Jomo Kenyatta. He said, and I quote, "Our children, born and unborn, may learn about the heroes of the past, but our present task is to make ourselves architects of the future." End of quote. This, fellow Kenyans, was a call to action. It was a call to predict the future by creating it. And against this backdrop, the national question of the moment must be poised. If indeed freedom is nothing but an opportunity to become better, how have we enriched what the founding fathers placed in our custody? Have we made it better than we found it? And has Kenya occupied its rightful place in the society of nations as a result of our improvements? I believe that that is the national question of the day. And in response to this question, I will use the four frames of our liberation struggle that have informed my administration. The first is economic. This frame is informed by the notion that political freedom in the absence of economic freedom is nothing but an illusion. Given that the founding fathers stood for economic inclusion and the administrations before mine was about economic recovery, my administration has embraced the maxim of economic acceleration. Economic acceleration in my administration is about increasing the speed of achieving our national goals. And we have increased the speed at national, county, as well as individual levels. At the national level, the colonizers left us with a gross domestic product, which is a measure of our national cake, of close to Kenya shillings 6.4 billion in 1963, using the exchange rate of the time. After 74 years of colonial occupation, that is what Kenya was worth every year. The combined administrations of Mzee Kenyatta, Mzee Moi, and Mzee Kibaki increased this national cake to Kenya shillings 4.5 trillion, and they did this in a span of 50 years. In the last 8 years, my administration has doubled what the colonizers and the first three administrations did in 128 years. Our national cake, our annual worth as a country every year, now stands at Kenya shillings 10.3 trillion. And even if you factor in inflation, our economic acceleration program has multiplied what the founding fathers left in our custody. At the county level, we have allocated Kenya shillings 2.3 trillion to our counties. This is equivalent to 16% of our GDP. What this means is that we have sent to the counties the equivalent of what our national cake was between 1885, when the colonizers came to Kenya, and when President Moi retired in 2002. That is the money that has gone mashinani.